It's important to celebrate your victories, otherwise you'll get worn down to a frazzle. But also to know that you can't stop pushing, even on things you seem to have won, because if you stop, then they'll start sliding back to how it was before. In the court cases, the Supreme Court cases, we get huge impact because it creates case law that affects the entire country. However, we don't have much influence on how it gets implemented, except in the little, like the one Center for Addiction and Mental Health where we are, we can sort of push there, but then it becomes a war of interpretation. The reason I was in the hospital when I was young was for being suicidal. There's a period of time after I had attempted suicide, and then I was, a while after that, standing on a hill in the sun and the snow. It was a really beautiful day, and I was very happy. And I said to myself, remember that this feeling also happens. Peers have insights into things that happen decades before the system adopts it. Like the whole recovery model, like decades before, survivors were saying, actually, you told me like I had schizophrenia, I was going to be seriously mentally ill and medicated for the rest of my life, and I'm actually fine now. Like that was completely denied as an experience, and yet it was happening.
Welcome to another episode of Peer Journal. Today I'm with Jennifer Chambers and she'll introduce herself. In a minute, today we'll talk about peer advocacy, and I'm very excited to have her on the program all the way from Canada. Hi, Jennifer, how are you?
I'm good, happy to be here.
So, could you tell us what are you doing at the moment and where did you start?
So my job right now is executive director of the Empowerment Council, and Empowerment Council does systemic peer advocacy in the system, so policy level advocacy affecting hospitals, police, legislation, things like that. I started by founding an organization called the Queen Street Patient Council. So we were a voice for patients at one particular mental health facility in Toronto. And then I was hired to develop one. When that hospital merged with three other ones, I was hired to develop one both for the clients of the system and also the family members of the system, which is actually a very stupid job because they're often very different perspectives. I pointed that out, but they really wanted me to do both. So um, I developed both, and then I was hired by the council that represents the people with lived experience at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And in between, I founded something called the Mental Health Legal Advocacy Coalition, which I'm going to actually revive when I retire, which is going to be shortly.
Let's take it a bit even further back than that. How did you come into lived experience work? How did it start?
Well, in some ways, it started with a couple of hospitalizations in which I was extremely unimpressed with the quality of care. I left against medical advice, and I thought, yep, I am against it, not in favor of what I received at all. And then some years later, I had started a peer support group called Mental Health Oppression Survivors. And somebody who was connected to the wider world of what was then called psychiatric survivors told me that there's going to be a first ever meeting in Canada of peer organizations from across the country. And so I attended that, and that's how I got sort of connected to the larger movement. And there's a speaker there actually from Holland who talked about how they had patient councils, and that became the foundation of my career on developing councils at the hospitals in Toronto and then working for them. It's actually quite ideal. I wrote my job description and then I took the job. It's an ideal way to work.
How did you learn about the opportunity or just heard about the term peer support? How old were you? Like, how many years were between you becoming unwell, surviving the system, but then meeting peer support or the concept of lived experience?
It was about 10 years later. Um, I got involved in a sort of international peer support network and found it more helpful than anything I'd received sort of professionally. So um, I felt that there was a need for people who've been in the mental health system to have an alternative. So I started this peer support group sort of within that framework. And then I was hired to deliver, it's called Alternatives Facilitator for the first Ontario-wide group of psychiatric survivors and consumers. And but the ministry reached down and snuffed out my little job, thinking that at the time I thought, I guess I'd rather have someone challenging them, because most of the organization was advocacy, than competing with them. uh, it was a while before, quite a long while before peer support actually started in Ontario more broadly. Although we did at the time have a huge array of consumer survivor organizations, because we had the most left-leaning government we ever had at the time. And one of the advisors to the premier was a former politician who was an out psychiatric survivor, David Rebel. He was an amazing person. So that helped us get a lot of organizations started in Ontario. Unfortunately, it's since backslid a lot, but it was great at the time.
That's a pattern in lived experience work, in peer support, or anything doing a little bit of out of the box systems thinking, I suppose. Do you think, what do you think is the reason, and is it inevitable that backsliding happening?
Yeah, it's really hard to avoid as governments change and people in power shift around. I was talking to a group of young Black activists not too long ago, and were asking for advice, and I said, it's never done. It's important to celebrate your victories, otherwise you'll get worn down to a frazzle. But also to know that you can't stop pushing, even on things you seem to have won, because if you stop, then it'll start sliding back to how it was before. It does help to have a vision, to have something happen, even if it does backslide, to know that that was something that was possible. Like right now, for example, instead of peer advocacy being the main voice in Ontario, it's actually extremely rare now for there to be an advocacy organization by and for peers.
And I always say that it's one of the most important branches of peer support, I think, peer advocacy. Where I work in London in a mental health trust as a mental health peer coach, and doing advocacy is part of our work, but it's not at the core of it. So I can't say, yes, I try to do advocacy, but I'm not an expert and it's not specific to that. The focus is more like having the sessions and being supportive to people. So it's more left to the ability of the peer support worker or peer coach. And if the service provides space for you to do that work, and it's very subjective. How does it happen in Canada, peer advocacy? And specifically, how does it happen in Empowerment Council?
Well, because we do systemic advocacy, so Empowerment Council is only 2.5 staff positions, so we have to sort of go where we can get the biggest bang for the buck. And there is an organization, an Ontario professional organization, that does individual advocacy within psychiatric facilities. So what we do is try and change broad strokes. So if I am on the policy committee at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, so I get to have a voice in all the clinical policy at the centre, which can be challenging because it's a whole room full of staff and me, speaking up for rights. And sometimes I get support, and sometimes I get zero. And then I also I'm able to influence the practice of policing in Toronto. And that happened partly because our organization is the only one in Canada that is organization of people with lived experience that regularly gets standing at inquests. So those are inquiries into when someone dies a non-natural death in a mental health facility or by police or in a correctional facility. And as part of what happens at the inquest is the jury makes recommendations. And we found we're extremely successful at having juries adopt the recommendations that we make because they recognize we're the only people there who are actually in danger of a similar death happening to us, and who have no conflict of interest. We're not protecting our reputation. We're not defending ourselves from maybe having increased the likelihood of the death. We're just there because we want things to be better. And also we tend to, we talk to them in quite plain language, and they're not professionals, so that usually helps as well. I think that the big difficulty for a lot of peer support work with doing advocacy is the conflict of interest. Because when you're hired by a mental health service to do advocacy for its clients, then your employer is the very one that you often need to challenge in their practices, which then becomes very stressful, like for the peer support worker who quite understandably wants to retain their job. That's what I think will be the ideal situation, is for there to be independently funded organizations run entirely by and for peers who are contracted by different facilities and organizations to do individual peer advocacy and peer support work. As it is, I'll get like phone calls on the quiet from peer support workers sometimes to say this issue's come up, but it's not safe like for me to raise it, so I can address it somewhat
My,
indirectly that way.
I wholeheartedly support independently funded peer advocacy support and any peer support, frankly, if possible. Because I'm not very familiar with the policing and law in the UK, let alone in Canada, can you help me by giving an example, a story of how it works so we can picture it and viewers can picture it? Who gets support from you? How do they contact you? And what it's like? What happens afterwards? What are the steps?
Well, sometimes we'll get calls from individuals, and we'll use that to look into how the system is working around that individual. But we also tell them we can't help you like on an individual basis. We give them contacts for the other independent individual advocacy organizations. So a lot of the times the systemic issues come to our attention um, within the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And I want to point out that's a certain conflict of interest for us because we're funded by them, but we're also a completely independent nonprofit corporation. So I'm accountable only to the board, who are elected by the members, every one of whom is someone with personal experience of mental health or addiction. So there might be new legislation that's being drafted that we want to present the perspective of people with lived experience on. We'll hear of a death that's going to be inquested, and we'll apply for standing. When there's a case that's going up to the Supreme Court of Canada, we get what's called intervenor status. So we're also the only group in Canada that does this work. So we're a peer advocacy organization that can attend a Supreme Court of Canada hearing with a lawyer to represent us, who will explain the impact their decision will have on the people that will be most affected, and will make recommendations for the best way for them to rule to have the best outcome for our people. And we've also had a great deal of success with that.
That's brilliant. So you talked about applying. So how does it work? How do you access to that level, to people with decision making powers? Do they invite you? Are you happy? Are they happy? Sorry, it's are they happy to have you there, or there is a right to apply to be there, and you started make use of that? How does that work? It's very rare for people with lived experience or doing peer advocacy or peer support work accessing those environments. So that's why I'm very curious.
Yeah, it's true. It's fairly rare. And I'll just mention because I'd forgotten you'd asked about policing, that one of the ways we're able to influence policing is also through inquests. And then as a result of an inquest recommendation, we now have a standing organization that advises the Toronto Police Services Board on an ongoing basis, a mental health and addiction advisory panel. That was very hard to come by, because one of the things that happens at inquests is you sort of negotiate with other parties, try and get everyone to agree to certain recommendations, because then the jury will be more likely to adopt them. In this case, I wanted an ongoing organization, so we couldn't comment. We didn't have to wait for someone to die before we could make changes for the better. And everyone was telling me to drop it, because the police were saying, if you keep insisting, we're gonna not support any of your other recommendations. And we have a member of your community who's on a committee that we have. It's just a secret committee. Everything's kept confidential. And I argued back, well, you shouldn't take a well-meaning advocate and tell them they have to keep your secrets. It's not satisfying for our community to have something that has no transparency or accountability. So back and forth, back and forth. So right the last minute, 5 minutes before I was take the stand, and then the chair of the Police Services Board came and shook my hand and said, we agree to your recommendation. So now we have it, and as a result, we get to review all the police training on mental health every year and advise them on what's good and what's bad, and do this and do that. And also, because training isn't enough, on appraisals, like is the training getting used? And we introduced the idea of body-worn cameras so that we can see whether it's being used. It's kind of a progressive learning. Okay, that wasn't enough. Now try this. Okay, that wasn't enough. Now try that. Most recently, we succeeded in getting the police to train each other to interrupt each other. If like one person is doing something that isn't good, the others have a responsibility to stop them. And as for the other cases, like the Supreme Court of Canada, I'm not sure if it works this way in Britain, but in Canada, our law resembles yours to a considerable extent. A public interest group can apply for what's called intervenor status. So what you do is you prepare something, a legal document, an affidavit from me, and then a document saying this is what we want to say, and this is how we could bring a new and valuable perspective to the proceeding. And then that goes to the court, usually the Supreme Court of Canada, sometimes it's Appeals Court Ontario, and they decide whether they think that input would be valuable to hear, and they almost always decide that it would be. And the same at inquests, we apply for standing as a public interest group, and they decide whether we would be relevant to the proceedings. And initially, we really had to argue to get in there, but now they actually call us up and say, hey, maybe you're interested in this one. And they even want us sometimes to do more than we feel we have the capacity to do. So it's great that they have found us of value.
That's a very interesting transition. What do you think helped that transition from you having to fight to be there and then going to a point where you are invited? What do you think changed that?
I think that what prevented their support initially was a fear that we would just sort of be ideological grandstanders. You know, we'd say all these completely unrealistic things, like and things that couldn't actually be implemented, and that were vague and sort of going a bit too far. So, you know, more far than is realistic. Not that it's not good. For example, I support the idea of abolishing most coercive institutions. I shouldn't say most, but rather 99% of most institutions. But for the people who are stuck in the institutions, and I do get criticized sometimes for doing reform work as being a factor that can support institutions, but I also respond to that by saying, well, what am I supposed to do with the people who are in the institutions and suffering terrible rights abuses? Say, well, I'm not going to help you because I don't think you should be, this place that you're in should exist. So that's how we kind of reconcile that. And I think what the coroners found is that we make practical and implementable suggestions about what can happen, what can change. And also we have the very rare ability to track what happens with a lot of those recommendations. So because we got that ongoing committee with policing, we can see what they're doing with what we told them they need to do. And they want to do it because they don't want me to testify at the next inquest saying, if they had done this thing we told them last time, this person would still be alive. So they're motivated in that way, and that's how we're able to have a significant influence. And also, like sometimes they'll say something is done, and we're going, no, that's not what we meant by that, which has been really helpful as well. In the court cases, the Supreme Court cases, we get huge impact because it creates case law that affects the entire country. However, we don't have much influence on how it gets implemented, except in the little, like the one Center for Addiction Mental Health where we are, we can sort of push there, but then it becomes a war of interpretation, hospital lawyers versus the lawyers representing the patients.
I remember you talking about changing the law. Can you tell me the story of that?
Well, one example, this is an example that actually came because we went to Ottawa, our capital city, and when they're talking about changing the criminal code, how it affects people who come to the mental health system through the courts. So in this case, it was about people who are found unfit to stand trial. So, if you're considered not capable of instructing a lawyer, then you get sort of shuffled off under the something called unfit to stand trial, where you're held until you become fit, which for some people will be never. And it means that people who might have committed a very minor offense can be institutionalized for the rest of their lives because there's no off ramp other than becoming fit. So we presented on that at this legislative committee that was reviewing these parts of the criminal code, and they ended up supporting there being a way to stay the proceedings for people found unfit if they're not considered any risk to the public. And they credited us when they presented it in the legislature as having influenced their doing that. So that was really big moment for us. That was great.
Well done and congratulations.
Thanks.
How did you get to that point? Because it feels like it requires a lot of information on law, how law works and specific law works. Did you have a background in law? How did it come about?
It didn't. I just have a belief that anybody can learn anything if they really um, try. So I don't get intimidated by reading like medical journals and um, the law. I think I can read. Like I can. It's not as I think that I feel like professionals are kind of protective. Like you can't understand this because it's like it's about medicine, or you can understand this because it's about the law. It's like yeah, I can. To a considerable extent, I don't have the breadth of understanding that someone has who's specialized, but I have enough understanding that I can instruct our lawyer. It also helps to work with lawyers who really get you, so that they can explain, they know the impact we want to have, and then they can tell us if you take this tack, it'll have this effect probably. And sometimes I'll have a little back and forth with the lawyer, which I think is actually helpful to both of us, where I'll say, no, even though I know that saying that in this case will help this case, I, number one, don't believe that's totally true in every case. And secondly, if we have another case with this other thing happening, what I say in this case is going to have a negative effect on that case. And because I work like with the community, I can sort of contribute that, whereas the lawyer works more specifically in legal areas. Um, I think it helps actually that when I was a student, I was a teaching assistant for a course called Scientific Perspectives on Sex and Gender in the Women's Studies Department. And the whole gist of that course was teaching people how to critically analyze scientific articles. So I think that gave me some confidence in my ability to critically analyze things and also develop the skills to do critical analysis.
From what I hear, the work you have done and you are doing, as most of us, requires a lot of resilience. Life requires resilience, of course, but specifically when you are trying to intervene and make change on a systemic level, that's something else. So, what kept you going and what keeps you going? And when it's not a good day, how do you overcome that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Um, well, there's I guess two main areas that affect me the most. One is the inquests, because they're about someone's death, and sometimes there's a lot of the public who's very engaged with what happened to this person, and sometimes there's only us. Family's not there, no other member of the public is there. Maybe the media isn't paying that much attention to this one. That in many ways is the hardest for us, because you feel like we're the only voice that this person has, and the only one really paying attention to how they died. Um, but the other ones can also be really hard, like, especially now that we can watch the person die on videotape. It's devastating. We all find it really hard. So we support each other. It's great that I've sort of formed relationships with different lawyers that we work with, and we work primarily with one, but she brings in a lot of other people, and sometimes we work with other people. It varies. So I guess just by talking with other people about what happened, but that's hard too because if I talk to them about it, they get affected, and I don't want to like wound people. So there's not that many people I can take it to without worrying that I'm going to do something that's hard for them. Part of it also is developing a really dark sense of humor. Um, like there's this one inquest where um, someone got shot by police, but at the same time, like before they got shot, it was a mother and son who was involved in this case, and the mother came running out of the house and beaned the police officer with a big fry pan, and then the student officer accidentally shot her training officer in the butt, and just like this whole um array of like kind of a slapstick, like hard not to laugh. Although at the end of it all, somebody died, so also not funny at all. So there's that kind of bizarre thing that you have to just kind of talk behind the scenes, and sometimes when you're having to listen to people who are obviously misrepresenting what's happening, you get to make all sorts of sarcastic comments and jokes, like just within each other, between each other, um, and then deal with it in reality. And I think the other area that's hard is when I'm an advocate, say at the hospital, when it's everybody with one perspective and me with another. Because everybody wants to feel like they're in a room full of people who likes them. So being in a room full of people who all seem angry at you can be really hard. But I always I have in mind like an invisible person who I'm having to explain, gee, I'm really sorry that you don't have that right, but I'd really just wanted people to like me that day. Um, so instead, I kind of keep my eye on the people who I'm really working for, and it helps that my boards my boards have been great and really supportive, um, and I can debrief with them somewhat, and it helps you feel connected to the community that I'm working for.
That's brilliant. But I'm curious that this work can feel really isolated or defeating at times. And as you said, you need to celebrate victories when you have, because the work is never done. So where do you find hope on dark days? I understand the debrief, but I'm going, if there is any more personal kind of, some people are spiritual, some people are driven by not objective things. I feel like I have a calling, for instance. It's incredibly difficult for me to keep working physically, mentally, financially. Actually, I can't afford doing the job I'm doing because of because of the both, all we are all in financially. Um, so for me, it's the calling, because I never feel like working. It keeps me going. It keeps me motivated. And when I lose hope, I just remember how I felt before, and I know I'm gonna feel like that again. And even my whole life goes as feeling defeated, it doesn't matter. I know I've done the right work. I've done the right thing, and that's good enough for me. How does it work with you when you're at home on your own and you're not feeling great maybe?
That's brilliant what you do. Actually, what you described reminds me of not so much how I cope with work, but um, the reason I was in the hospital when I was young was for being suicidal, and when I there's a period of time after I had attempted suicide, and then I was a while after that standing on a hill in the sun and the snow. It was a really beautiful day, and I was very happy. And I said to myself, remember that this feeling also happens. Because I find that when you're feeling one thing, trying to remember feeling something else, it's like trying to remember being hot when you're really cold. It's very hard to remember. So I sometimes feel like my brain just has to drag my feelings along, saying, okay, you don't feel this way now, and it feels like it'll never end, but it will. Um, so sometimes it's that. Um, I'd say I'm more resilient now, like on a emotional level. I for a long time I felt like I have a lot of supportive people in my life. Um, that's probably the most important thing is my friends, um, and um, my family eventually, not so much early on. Um, and I'd say I try to focus on anything good that came out of something I did and not just how we lost, and commiserate with the other people who were involved in something and plan for what to do next. I think the fact my work feels meaningful to me is the most important thing, which is why I'm not going to give it up on retirement. I'm going to keep doing some of it. It helps me feel connected to the world, um, and that hopefully I can have a positive influence in it. Or there's one time when I had been working for several years on a bill of patient rights at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, and I've been going back and forth and back and forth between the patients and the staff, and we had a meeting where some of the staff said the most outrageous things like, um, well, if we give patients more rights, then they're more likely to like be racist and sexist. And I said, really, is that what you think? Because I think if you respect people, they're more likely to treat other people with respect. And somebody said, well, staff don't have rights. And it's like, yeah, they do. Like, they have a collective agreement. They have all sorts of rights. And somebody said, oh, a lot of hospitals want to have responsibility sections attached to rights. Like, you have these rights, but you have to do these things. I said, who else has that? Like, no other rights has that attached to it. So rights are meant to address a power imbalance. You're not supposed to get all sorts of obligations tacked on. So there's this big argument, and then it went to the board and it didn't get passed. And I was so defeated feeling. But that night I was going to this big meeting of the Urban Alliance on Race Relations with some anti-racist activists I've been working with for a long time. And they were so great. I was at the table with people, most of whom I didn't know, and they're all going, like, we've all had that. You just have to go on, like don't give up. And fighting the good fight is a value in itself. So kept going, and we did eventually get the bill passed.
And I think that's the crux of the matter, isn't it? It's living a value driven life. And not everybody does that or has a chance to do that as well. It's, you know, I have a feeling I am able to live a value driven life. Yes, I worked for it, but at least half of it was coincidence and good luck. I got my job because I was going to focus groups because they were giving vouchers and I needed them to get by. And then I thought I was going to a focus group and it was a recruitment workshop. And that's how it all started. It didn't happen immediately that year. I went back the next year because I was on a very restrictive visa, so on and so on. But it's such a mix. But sometimes when I'm working with people and when they say, "Oh, I thought only I felt like that." Right? I'm in the room. That's my favorite moment when I'm speaking to a person and they're experiencing the peer support for the first time. And I tell this to a lot of people, not only to the people I work with in the service. When I say people I work with, I mean the clients. I just don't like to call them clients, but sometimes it's not clear when I call them people. Um, and to my friends as well. I've been doing this 8 years. I worked with hundreds of people, all with different lengths, different backgrounds, different ages, different identifications, blah, blah, blah. And I always say that the people ended up in a room with me, they only had one thing in common. They all, and it wasn't a mental health diagnosis, it wasn't a suicide attempt or what they did or what they didn't do. They were all people with a very strong set of values who just couldn't live towards their values. They didn't have any channels, they didn't have any means to live a life by their values, and they just couldn't let go of the values either, and they were stuck in between. And we always do value work and try to explore how we can configure life within the conditions you have right now today. So do you find that when you describe that room that you felt a part of immediately, do you agree with that? Do you think when there's a value alignment, you don't need to name the value. It doesn't mean that we would name all the same values, or it's not an objective thing necessarily. But I find that fascinating whenever I'm meeting and getting along in a room or feel part of it. It's all about the common values in that room.
Yeah, I think that's wonderfully described. I find that something that surprises me sometimes, because we do policy level work, is people will sometimes say being on that board changed my life. Because I got the feeling I could contribute to the world in a meaningful way. And sometimes people go out in different ways and then go on to do that in various ways. I also feel extremely lucky that I get to do work that's meaningful to me. Um, I know a lot of people would love to do that and just don't have the resource support to be able to. And sometimes we'll get people as part of our organization who have very different views from each other, but very different values, different life experience. But I find that there are commonalities that if I really sort of stretch, we can find a lot of common ground. And I can like sometimes point out things where people will say things that superficially are different, but underneath are kind of the same. Like, for example, somebody who's very, when I was doing the Bill of Rights, I had people come to me who said, electroconvulsive therapy should never be allowed. And other people who came and said, don't oppose electroconvulsive therapy, it saved my life. So I had to kind of find a middle ground there that both could agree to, and both agreed that fully informed consent, telling someone of all the risks that were involved, was a middle ground. And I find people like they want to have a good outcome for as many people as possible. They can see that as well if you talk to them for a while. Um, and it's good for me to get stretched, like to have to think of things that might not agree with my particular values, but to see it from the other person's perspective and allow that if I'm going to say that um, the system shouldn't impose values on someone, then I don't have any business doing that either. Um, and the sort of underlying idea is to help support the person having the power to sort of manifest their life the way they want it to be at a broad level.
I wanted to ask you, actually, usually you are the answer to this question when people ask me, just so you know. But my question is there anyone, any person, any organization, any platform you would like to celebrate and shout out and let the viewers know about, and maybe they would follow them and it's good to learn about them?
Well, to put a self-interested plug in, I'm going to be restarting the Mental Health Legal Advocacy Coalition in about in a few months, and I'm really hoping to have a more international perspective because I'm hoping that um, I can share like how to influence police, um, how to use the courts and things like that with more people. And I'll be doing it from now on a voluntary basis, which is fine because I won't have to put in sort of the daily work. I can, I hope, respond more to the needs and interests of people. So I encourage anyone listening to this, if they that interests them, to I will eventually have a website for that group. And if people are wanting to take on leadership in the peer realm, or they are leaders and want some support and want to hear what other people have done for inspiration, um, I suggest people check that out because it's very cool.
Definitely. Thank you for that. Um, Finally, how do you see the future of lived experience? How would you like to see it?
Where I'd like to see it ideally would be that it be independent, um, so that instead of or mental health organizations hiring peer support workers to work for them, that instead there be a source of funding so that people with lived experience can decide this is the kind of organization we most need, and this is what we want them to do, and these are the resources to support them doing it. And then other organizations can come to that organization and contract people. So, say they want a peer perspective on policy they're developing or legislation, or what do people in crisis want when they're in crisis other than police or medical people showing up. um, and they could deliver peer support as well, and but they would have themselves to offer each other mutual support. And it has a lot of advantages. One is protecting people if they're in an environment where someone's getting peer support and they think that perhaps that person is not being treated that well. It would protect them so that they could speak up without fear of losing their job or being silenced by their bosses. Um, and it also, on the policy level, it's really helpful to have more, like the support of more than one perspective. So you can say, you're not just getting my personal opinion. I've checked with my group, and this is like the broad perspective that people have, or this is the range of perspectives that people have. So I'd really love to see that happen more. And I feel the fact we've gotten away from that is because the system adapted to what we were doing by doing something that was more controlling, and they wanted to control us more. Um, so we had a less independent voice. Because I really find that peers have insights into things that happen decades before the system adopts it. Like the whole recovery model, like decades before, survivors were saying, actually, you told me like I had schizophrenia, I was going to be seriously mentally ill and medicated for the rest of my life, and I'm actually fine now. Like that was completely denied as an experience. And yet it was happening. And it didn't get recognized till for so long because the system resisted it so much. And like the whole hearing voices movement, support and otherwise movement is fabulous, like a fabulous alternative, very exciting. So I think that, and there's one case, for example, where somebody at the center died in restraints. And I was on the stand saying about our funder that if they had listened to us when we told them about how they're using restraints and how what they should not be doing, then that person would still be alive. So I think we have an incredibly important voice. I think we have the most important voice in the system. And it's frustrating how much the system resists that out of self-interest. And I feel like they don't want to admit it's out of self-interest, and possibly they don't even see it because they're so invested in being the experts. Um, so I think that the data supports us more than them. I think that we come to the truth sooner than they do. Um, so I'd like to see the system revolve around what we say is needed rather than what professionals say is needed.
I totally love that view. I'd love to see that vision in real life. So, thank you for joining me today for this lovely conversation. Um, Before we go, have you got any questions for me?
What's your vision for this series that you have done so creatively and interestingly, which I can't wait to see the whole thing? Um, what effect do you want it to have?
First of all, I hope everybody feels like that. That's great to hear. Thank you for that. It's it came about, number one, I love talking, as everybody can recognize, but number two, because I do peer support in a room one to one, and I have, of course, conversations with my colleagues in breaks, but those sessions bring up so much stuff that I want to talk about, but I never get a chance to do so. And whenever I mentioned this, anyone I met in research world, in other trusts, in different executions of this work, and they all said, yes, it's so needed. We experience the same. We don't have any space to talk about the lines in between. And that's how the podcast came about, actually. So I just wanted to show other people, look at all these amazing people I know. They are so inspiring. And whenever I talk about any of you, any of these guests, and even more people I meet through the other, conferences I go and other projects I do, people find it inspiring as well. And it's so important for people who this work in an isolated way to remember that we're more crowded than we think. There are more people doing their best. There are more allies we think there are. We just don't feel it. So I hope people will feel that by listening to all of you.
We talk about peer work sort of amplifying the voice of the people, and you are literally doing that by capturing different perspectives and voices and allowing it to be available to more people. I'm grateful that you've done that.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you to all of our viewers and listeners who prefer to listen, and hope to see you in another episode. Thank you, Jennifer.